Okay. And then just so everyone knows, we do have our Sparkle Awards coming up. I just wanted to make a quick plug for that. On May 22nd at Stony Creek High School, outdoors in the stadium. If you're not familiar with the Sparkle Awards, it's been, I think, a few decades now that we've been doing this to honor everyone in special education who helped make our year better. This is done through nominations by students and parents, and they can nominate anyone, their bus driver, their teacher, anyone who has touched their lives. And it's a beautiful thing. And we're so happy. Last year, we unfortunately had to cancel. So we were trying to adapt and be able to be together this year. So we're really excited to make that happen. And current restrictions are allowing us to have a pretty good capacity at the stadium. So we're excited. And so May 22nd, and to help us with our COVID restrictions, if you can, just please RSVP if you're planning to come. We just need a head count. We're not doing tickets or anything formal, but rcspac.com and RSVP for the Sparkle Award. You can get a calendar reminder, and we'll just kind of have a head count so we know what we're working with. And I want to say thank you to our administrators who are here today. Concetta will be leading our presentation. Concetta Lewis is the Executive Director of Special Education. And also with us tonight is Natasha Smith, who is a supervisor for early childhood and elementary special education. So thank you both for being here. And I'm going to hand it over to Concetta.
Okay, am I able to share my screen? Do I have that?
So,
okay, let's see.
I didn't restrict it.
Okay. All right. You would think that I would be all like, yeah, I'm ready for Zoom. I know what to do. Every time it's like I've never done it before. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight we are going to, I was trying to think of some catchy thing to describe what we're talking about. So I came up with the IEP top 10 considerations for parents. And I will probably age myself with this statement. But David Letterman used to have, the top 10. I think I went in the wrong order, but you get the picture. So tonight we're going to talk about the IEP process, the components of the IEP, but really focusing on things that as a parent, you should kind of have your radar up for or take notes to. One of the things, and Natasha can step in at any point if, as I'm going through this, if there's something that to add. But one of the main things about the IEP process that I think sometimes both sides, we often forget. One, this part I know we all have, children are the priority, but change is a reality in the IEP process. And just because we, meet for that quote unquote annual IEP and have a conversation on April 7th, that doesn't mean that there might be some new data that occurs on April 8th or May 8th or June 8th where we need to come back together, review and revise and make some adjustments. So collaboration is the strategy. And I know sometimes that's not always easy from the parent perspective, because sometimes you feel like, the school district is they're the experts, or sometimes you feel like they're not listening to me. I'm trying to tell them, just because they have a degree doesn't mean that, they know everything. This is my child. I know what's going on. So finding a way to build that collaboration and always circling back to the student that we're talking about is kind of the heart of where I'm coming from in my approach in general. So with that, we will get started. So here are, we'll have a quick, just kind of overview of the IEP process. I'm looking to see here. Melissa, do you have any idea? I guess the other piece that I'm wondering too is for the folks that are on, there are a couple of folks that I know, but there are also a couple of people that I'm not as familiar with in terms of, are they new to the IEP world? Do you not have a student with an IEP? Have you been in it for 5 years? Student is in high school. Feel free to take your mic off and give me some feedback. I'm open to it.
I mean, that's not a question we asked, although that probably would have been a good one. I definitely recognize some veteran names here, and there's a few I don't recognize at all.
Okay. So as I'm going through this, I will try to, and especially since you're recording, Melissa, I'll
Mhm.
try to keep it on a broad spectrum for, um, you know, most folks. So we'll again talk about those sections of the IEP, right? These are the sections we all know about: demographics, participants, eligibility, right? Factors to consider. So these are kind of the sections of the IEP, and within each of those sections, things that I think are important from the parent perspective is what we'll address tonight. And then we'll do some Q&A at the end. That's always the fun part. So when we think about the IEP process, the first thing is typically it starts with a referral of some kind or a child find. There might be something going on. Maybe as a parent, depending on the age of your child, say if it's a young student that's 3 years old, maybe you've gone to your physician, or maybe you've been a part of our early intervention, early on program, which is for birth to 3, which I am not addressing in this. I'm really sticking to the individualized education plan for students ages 3 to 26 in this presentation. And I would be happy to, if we wanted to take some time on for another scenario, do something specifically for the individualized family service plan process, which is just a little bit different than the IEP process. So the short version is, we identify, hey, there's something going on. We refer to a school team, whether it's a teacher, a parent, a principal. Let's come together, look at this student, determine, do we need to make some recommendations for perhaps some interventions? Do we want to try some things? Let's see what's going on. Or we've done some things, here's some data on that. The student still isn't progressing, and we need to move into a formalized evaluation process. So then we go into the evaluation process. We receive parent consent to move forward with that process. So child find and referral, there's not necessarily a parental consent that is required. Once we move into the eligibility process, the evaluation process, we must have parent consent to evaluate. And so a school district just can't say, well, we think there's a situation we want to evaluate for special ed. We have to sit down, talk with parents, and get your written permission to conduct that evaluation. And within that process, it's not just we say, yeah, we want to evaluate. We sit down and really talk about what we're looking at are these particular areas, and here's why we're looking at those areas. So you, as a parent, you would agree to have these components looked at. Sometimes what happens in that process as the team is evaluating, they may discover, oh, there's some additional information that I'd like to get. Then they bring the parent back to get consent for those additional components. So it's not just you sign and we can, do any evaluation we want to do. For every evaluation that we do, we must have written consent from the parent. Once we've done that, the team will come together within 30 school days after the parent has signed that written consent. And this is one of the areas that varies a little bit slightly for Michigan law versus the IDEA. Currently, IDEA is within 60 days of that parent signature, but it's just calendar days, whereas Michigan is 30 school days. So within 30 school days, the team will come together with the parent, look at that data, review that data, and look at the criteria for eligibility to determine if the student, if they want to make a recommendation for the IEP team to determine eligibility for the student. This part is a little bit tricky as you go from eligibility to the IEP. So even if the recommendation of they call it the multi-evaluation, multidisciplinary evaluation team, even if that team's recommendation is that the student won't qualify, that decision is still made at an IEP team meeting. So again, what the IEP team does is look at that information that this other team has combined to determine if the student would be eligible for special education And if eligible for special ed, what program supports and services we will initiate for that student. For an initial IEP, parents, again, once the IEP team has determined here's what we like to do and the district makes a formal offer of FAPE, parents have to sign consent for the initial provision of services. I'm going to date myself again because there was a time that every IEP that was had required parents to sign the IEP. Now, the only time that parents have to sign is for the initial provision of services. So that very first time that a student is determined to be eligible. Following that initial IEP, what's required is a review of that IEP at least annually. That doesn't mean it can't happen more often. And I think this is one of the areas where sometimes parents might get a little intimidated. If the annual IEP date is, March 1st, and I've discovered something or I have some concerns and I'd like for that team to come back together on April 15th to look at that, we can do that. Annually is the minimum amount of times that team has to come back together at least once, but it can happen more times throughout that year, and that is okay. And again, it's a process. So each year we're looking at data, collecting data, and then every 3 years, if a student is determined eligible, again, this is one of those at a minimum every 3 years, the team comes back together to say, here's the data that we have. Do we need to do any additional assessments to determine if this student will remain eligible? Or do we have enough data to say, you know what, the child will still be eligible? Or do we need to do some assessments to determine if eligibility is still available for the student? Now, let me tell you, my goal is that as we are, especially for the majority of students with a speech and language impairment, students with a specific learning disability, it is our hope that once that initial IEP happens within a few years, as we begin to provide service and support for that student, that they would either need less service and support or that they would no longer be eligible for services because we have closed that gap. And so sometimes parents get nervous when we get to that crossroad where it might be time to pull back services for a student, but that's a good thing. That's okay. Again, remember that I'll say this, that it's not the school district versus the family. It's us working together for the best for that student and for the needs of the student. All right, so number 1, demographics. And I'm sorry, let me grab please pardon me. This traffic has really got me, but let me grab my printout with my notes on it.
While she's doing that, if you have a question, if you submitted a question beforehand, I'll read them out on your behalf anonymously. If you have another question you want to ask, feel free to put it in the chat, or Concetta can call on people when she's ready as well.
All right. So demographics, the reason that I highlighted this, you're like, Concetta, really, you gonna put demographics on the list? But yes, I put it on the list because the demographics is really how the state and the federal government uses the information in the IEP to look at our performance as a school district. So we have what's known as those state performance plan indicators. For transition, it's B13. There are some for early childhood. There are graduation rates. So disproportionality. So this information is used to see how are we doing as a school district with various components. So the demographic information is important, even though you might think, well, who cares if my address is right? But it's a little more involved in that. So that is why I included that one. IEP participants. We all know that I think, the required participants of the IEP team, typically the student definitely at age 16, but I certainly recommend the students who are younger even elementary students participating in IEP team meetings. It will help them. Our goal is to help them understand what their strengths and their weaknesses are as a student and how to navigate the academic world and academic life. And so maybe the student might not be there for the entire meeting, but I think having them there, talking about what things we're working on, things they might need help with, and helping them understand how to navigate what their needs are as a student is important. Parents certainly are a big part of this, and gen ed teachers, even and I know you all, my team is probably going to get me for saying this, but one of the areas that what I want to work on especially at the early childhood level, is having a gen ed teacher for our ECSE programs that are at buildings. I'm going to work with teams to begin to see, can we have a kindergarten teacher that is at those buildings as a part of those conversations, especially for students that might be 4 years old and the following year they will enter kindergarten. I think that will bring more to the conversation about what needs are there, how we can best prepare students for elementary level. And so looking at those pieces. Again, if there's a specialist, whether that is someone that the family is working with, or if we have a specialist from Oakland Schools, one of the TCs for a particular area, they would come to the meeting, building administrator, and related service providers. And again, even for our ECSC programs that are in buildings, I just communicated to the team on yesterday through my Tuesday tips that they should be inviting the building administrators at the elementary buildings to attend those IEP meetings. And again, the goal for that is to really begin to build that bridge between ECSC and elementary, so that as our students transition, we are doing a better job at preparing them for that elementary component. Number 3. Now, as you can see, I stole this from somebody, but I was like, oh, it's so cute. And the categories for the most part are pretty much the same as in Michigan. But once a student is eligible for special ed, they can receive any service. One of the things that we often hear, and on this list, I'll say that orthopedic is likely what we call in Michigan a physical impairment. Multiple disabilities would be a severe multiple impairment, and intellectual disability would be cognitive impairment. But what I wanted to say is, in Michigan, when we report data to the state, so back to that demographic section, there's a section on the IEP for eligibility, and you can have a primary disability and a secondary disability listed in the IEP. The only thing that gets reported to the state is the primary eligibility, but you can list the second one. And there are situations where a student might be eligible in multiple categories. And so the conversation that the IEP team is having is, of these 3 disabilities, which one is the one that is most prevalent, that is really having the biggest impact on the student. So there's no rule that says that a student can only be eligible in one area. They could be, meet the criteria in multiple areas. And then as a team, the IEP team, you come together to say, what is going to be our area of focus? All right, factors to consider. So this is a fun section of the IEP. Can you all hear me okay? I guess by now you would have said you couldn't. Okay. So factors to consider. This section includes lots of pieces to it, and we'll go through some of those in the next slide. But one of the pieces for me is that parent input for the IEP meeting. This is, again, a critical component. And it's not just, well, I'm okay. Really, if there are things that are on your mind as a parent, concerns that you have, And you don't have to wait until the day of the meeting to express those. As things come up, please communicate that to your building team, to your building administrator. Let's talk through what concerns that you have. So by the time we get to the IEP meeting, what we're merely doing is documenting conversations that we've already had, which is really how this process should work, right? This should really be a documentation of conversations that we have been having, and we're just coming together to formalize this information.
Yes.
The other one is around, I'm going to go back for one moment, that data piece, recent evaluation data, right? So this might include things like if there's district assessments, state assessments, if the student was recently evaluated from an eligibility standpoint, if there were some assessments done by a school psychologist, social worker, speech pathologist, teacher. So those things would be included. The other piece here, when we look at these special factors, these are things that every IEP team must consider in terms of what are going to be the needs for students. So is there a need to address any behavior challenges that the student might be having? Does the student have limited English proficiency? Are they an English language learner? Is this a student who is blind or visually impaired and will need some assistance in that area? Is the student deaf or hard of hearing? And then are there any assistive technology devices and services that will be needed? One thing that I will say, I think sometimes when we think about assistive technology, we always go high tech. It's always go big or go home, right? But there are also many low tech or no tech things that are also considered assistive technology. So really talking through with the team kind of what the concerns are, to think about how we might address what those needs are. Assistive technology, this is an area that as a district we are looking at and evaluating how we can improve our assistive technology support for students in the district. So we will likely even be making some changes to our assistive technology processes in the future. Now, section 5. This is a biggie, the PLAF. First of all, can someone tell me what happened to the P at the end of that? It's just, we have these acronyms in special ed. But this is the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And what is this, right? It is really a statement of what do we know about the student's performance at this time? How is the student doing with accessing the curriculum, right? So this has information for every area that we could possibly think about for the student. It has academic components. It has social emotional components. If there are any health or other related issues, they are there. So every piece of the school environment is there, and we look at what's our baseline data for how the student is doing in that particular area. What needs does the student have in that area, right? So this is just really where we're collecting data, and we're also looking at if they've had an IEP before, how did they do on their previous goals? Did they meet their goals? Did they not meet them? Did they almost meet them? So looking at all of those types of information within that component. Now, the PLAF, I just talked about this. This is the foundation for the goals. And the PLAF, a lot of people use the terminology that the PLAF is what drives the IEP, right? So the information that's in the PLAF is what we use to determine what we are going to do in the other components coming up in the IEP. It's not what the student's eligibility is. It's the data about what the student needs that helps us determine that. So it doesn't matter if the student is deaf or hard of hearing. It doesn't matter if the student has a speech and language impairment. It doesn't matter if the student is a student with autism. It just matters what needs do they have as a student. Once they, it's like going to your grandma's house. I don't know if you guys remember, a few years ago, there was a video that went viral, and it was a little boy. He was calling his mother Linda because I don't know if he had a cupcake or something he had gotten into, and he was like, listen, Linda, listen. Grandma said I can have anything when I come over here. So I don't know why you're all upset that I ate this cupcake, because when I'm at grandma's house, I can have anything. So listen, Linda, I can have anything. And it's the same concept. My mother used to tell me when I was a little girl, you are at home now. You're not at grandma's house. You better get it together. Once you come in and are eligible for special ed, the student can receive any service and support or resource that we have access to as a district, providing there's data to support that need. So as long as there's data to support that need, then we can provide the service. If they are, again, deaf and hard of hearing, but they need some math support, we can provide that resource support. So it's not about what's the eligibility. It is about what that need is, and that is what we have in the PLAF for students. Now, secondary transition. This is required for students who are 16 years or older. I highly recommend it for all secondary students, especially students at the high school level. Part of the considerations for transition, and this is really key, is you look here, there's an age appropriate transition assessment. So as we go through the process with students, what type of data, every time we have something in an IEP, if we're putting something in an IEP, I know my team gets tired of me because I always say, what's the data that's going to help us make this decision? So what type of data are we collecting around what the student's needs will be for post-secondary opportunities? So that means we're talking with the student. We're looking at their course of study. And by course of study, we mean, will the student graduate with a regular high school diploma? Or is this an opportunity where the student might leave us with a certificate of completion based on what their individual needs are as a student? There might be times where maybe, typically students earn a diploma in 4 years. Maybe we are looking at, is this a student that we're going to add a 5th year to, but at the end of those 5 years, they will have earned their high school diploma. So this is an opportunity for us to really look at, what are the needs for students? Do we need to collaborate with any outside agencies to say, how can we help this student move through and into adulthood? So those are some of the components of the secondary transition considerations. Now, here is a very critical piece, especially if you're a parent of a younger student that will turn 18. And I actually have this situation with a student that we have placed in an out-of-district program. The student has turned 18. The parents have requested to have an IEP meeting, and the out-of-district placement, which is the correct thing to do, has said, we need to have permission from your child before we can invite you to this meeting, or even have this meeting. And so it's really important to think about, if you have a student that will not graduate high school before they turn 18, developing kind of what is the plan for how we will support. Will we work on guardianship? What are we going to do? Who's going to be designated to support that student if we think the student will have some challenges with doing that themselves and making decisions once they get 18. Whether, we have students now who have documented cognitive impairments, but the parents don't have this information. And so those students are making their own life decisions. And again, that's okay. But as a parent, just understand kind of that complexity and that piece for as your child gets older. The other piece that I think is really, we talked about collecting data and doing a transition assessment, right? After we do those assessments, then we begin to look at what type of transition related goals, which might align with goals in some other areas when we talk about goals and objectives. But what transition activities are we going to develop or plan for this student based on, again, what those assessments, whether it's a student interview, the child's educational development plan, based on the information that's there, what type of activities. And again, the student at this point should be involved in the conversation. So it's not the team doing this, but the student should be heavily involved in this conversation for these transition. Again, what type of activities? If it's a student that we once says, my goal is to attend a 4-year university, right? So then we need to have some activities around helping that student prepare for that. And then who's going to be responsible? Sometimes it might be the student. Sometimes it might be the parent. Sometimes it might be the teacher or another staff member at the building. And then what's the date that we do it? And if there's something that we considered but it's not applicable in this situation, we would denote that as well. And then here again, I talked about course of study earlier, documenting what is the student's course of study. Are they working toward a high school diploma? And then also the personal curriculum. That's a whole nother presentation, but having a personal curriculum for some students might be an option, depending maybe if they are in go to OTEC and they're taking some courses through OTEC, they might and sometimes be able to swap out some of the other required courses. That's the real short version of that. Now, number 7, annual goals. Now, annual goals, this is another one of those things for the district. It keeps getting us. This has been on the radar from the state and federal level. At least as far as I can remember at this point, I'm going to say for the last 10 years or more, we've been talking about these measurable annual goals. And so one of the things that I talk with staff about is making sure that those goals are what we call quote unquote SMART goals, meaning that they are specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, is something that the student can do, they're realistic, and there's a time frame that we expect that the student would be able to do this. One of the things that is unique about, it used to be measurable goals and objectives. And what has happened in IDEA, it only talks about measurable goals. So the goal, that big goal at the top must be SMART. The short-term objectives don't necessarily have to have that same criteria as the goals, but the annual goals must meet that SMART criteria. And this is taken directly from IDEA, and it's really just, there's a statement that the goal is designed to meet the child's needs, again, things that were identified in the PLAF, and it's to help the student make progress in the general education curriculum and meet any of the other educational needs that the student may have. So I think the key takeaway for this is the goal definitely must be measurable. The short-term objectives, there are some flexibility on. And by measurable, again, it's written so that a couple of things by that. If somebody else sees it, if you move to Florida and you take this IEP and you go to another state, they can clearly understand what the goal was. And also that attainable factor. In writing goals, they should be realistic based on the student's capacity and need. So you might have 2 students that are in the same gen ed classroom, in the same grade level, but their goals might be very, very different based on what their individual needs are as students. things that a well written goal contains. Again, I said it must be measurable. And then in order to determine, here are some components. What's the baseline data that we're using to develop that goal? What's the specific skill that we are measuring? What's our expected outcome? And then what's our tool of measurement? What are we doing? The student will 80% of the time, 3 out of 4 times. So what's our method of measurement for those students? What is our expectation? Again, here's just kind of what information is included in the goal. Again, that baseline data is really important. That skill, what we are moving toward, and again, how are we measuring that? Now, here's another big one. Supplementary aids and services. Now, looking to see if I had any key notes before I move to the slide. Okay. So supplementary aids and services, these are things that aid services supports, right? That will help students to be educated with students who are not disabled. So this has come directly from the federal law. So that's kind of the broad, the big term of what this means. How does this play out in our IEP process, right? So supplementary aids and services are provided, again, to help the student working toward those goals, to help them make progress in the gen ed curriculum and participate in extracurricular or non-academic activities, and then be educated as much as possible with non-disabled students. Now, this is one of the areas of the IEP that I know staff members don't, I probably get on their nerves at this particular component or section. So there are 3 areas here. We've got what is the, what's the support, right? And this is just one area from the IEP. There are lots of areas. I just did this one. But so what does the student need would go here. And maybe for this one, it might be something like text read to the student. Now, the condition, we should not, I'll say it like this. It's not recommended that we put in all gen ed classes and, on all reading assignments. The condition is under what circumstances does this student need this support. So for something like having the text read to the student, it might be when the text level is above the student's current reading level, right? So being very specific and targeted about when that student needs that support. For example, maybe a student might need some support with, help zipping up a coat or something, right? We wouldn't say in all settings. Again, being very specific about when that support is needed and where that support is needed. So we wouldn't just say, necessarily, all gen ed settings. So in gym class, for example, might not be a need. I'm back to the reading one. There might not be a need for reading, right? So it might be in courses or in classes where the text will be above the student's reading level. So really being very specific about where and when and under what conditions does that student need that support. So if, again, the catch-all phrases should really be avoided in this situation, because again, our goal is always to help the student develop as much independence as possible and to fade support when possible. So we want them to be sure to have opportunities for success when they can do, and then we can scaffold that support when they still need it. Section 9, assessments. This section really goes hand in hand with the supplementary aids and services. So for assessments, each assessment that students take, whether it's iReady in district, whether it is M-STEP, whether it's the SAT or the PSAT, if those accommodations that we would like for the student are not listed in the supplementary aids and section of the IEP, then we should not be documenting those in assessments. So anything that's in assessments should really be a carryover from what is in the supplementary aids and services section of the IEP. And I put M-STEP up here, but I forgot to put my access. And so I do apologize, but that is another assessment that we have. And so for each one of those assessments, there are standard and non-standard accommodations. And when you cross over into the world of SAT, it's more allowed and not allowed. And there has to be documentation to support that. So at the high school, there's an assessment coordinator that is getting information to College Board about what accommodations the students need. And then there are very strict rules about how those accommodations are to be provided to students. Whereas with M-STEP, it's in-state. We just say this is what we are going to provide to the student and we give it. We don't have to submit any type of documentation to the state. And then with iReady, that assessment, we don't typically, again, make any type of, there are some standard accommodations within the program. I know that I'm using this term incorrectly, but I believe you will get the picture. It calibrates as the student is going through the assessment. It's adjusting the levels based on the student's correct and incorrect responses. It's adjusting for that as the student is taking the assessment. So there are some assessments where you can have the text read to the student. But if we are testing for the student's ability to read and understand themselves what they have read versus just a comprehension component, then having text read to the student might not be appropriate, because then that's not a true measure of whether or not they understand how to read the text. And so depending on what the test is, depends on whether or not an accommodation would be considered standard or non-standard, and how that test might be scored by at the state or national level. Now, this is the best one. This is the good part, right? By the time we get here in the IEP, sometimes we're like, whoo, yes, we're almost at the end. Programs and services. And sometimes we're like, oh, Lord, programs and services. Because the goal is always to have the student in the least restrictive environment as much as possible, right? So we would love to have all students down here in the blue. And I'm going to take a moment and have my soapbox moment, and you all have to go with me for a minute. One of the things that, as I, discovered, when you're young, you discover and you hear people talk about, yes, we are, looking for full funding. You hear these legislators talk about full funding for IDEA and yada, yada, yada. Well, when they say full funding, what they really mean is we are, because from the federal perspective, they've never provided the amount of funding that they originally said that they would for special education. So when they say full funding, they just mean let's get up to the amount that we said we were going to give. They're not necessarily saying that we're going to give schools all of the full, complete costs of providing special education services. So, in the cost-free world, we would have every classroom with co-teachers and, that's in the let's see, now we are billionaire, trillionaire. One morning I heard him on the news show talking about what comes after trillion, but I can't remember. But anyway, that's in that world where all students would always be here because we would just have unlimited resources to be able to add support into that general education classroom. Unfortunately, that's not the world that we live in. So the continuum of services and supports that districts offer, again, we start with that gen ed with no special ed. Then we go to gen ed with maybe some direct special ed services and other related services within the class. So there might be some push in inside of the student's class. Then we move into that component, and this typically at our high schools and even some of our middle schools, we have lots of co-taught courses for students at those levels. Then we go into pull out special ed classes, right? So maybe the student goes to the resource room or goes to see the speech therapist or goes to the school social worker. The orange, when we get to that orange alert, we're really getting there. That orange alert is really more of a categorical classroom. It might be even, and I'll take you through kind of the continuum within Oakland County. It might be a countywide specialized program. That means that we've exhausted all of our resources within the district to support the student, and now we are looking at a countywide program for support. And then the most restrictive is students who might be at home or in a hospital or in a residential facility. So that is the broad continuum. And when we place students with an IEP, it's not about their disability, service and availability. And let me say this while I'm on this here moment. When you're in a IEP meeting, service availability, we shouldn't have service providers or teachers say, I'm only going to see him once a week because I don't have any more room in my schedule. So if you hear that, then, maybe pause and say, well, let's check with a special ed administrator, because what we want to do is put in that IEP what service and support the student needs. And if we then need to hire additional staff to meet that need, then we will meet the need. So we don't write IEPs based on the number of staff that we have. We write IEPs and develop IEPs based on the needs of the student. We don't do it based upon space. Well, we don't have any more slots in our ASD program. So, sorry, Charlie, can't help you. No, what happens is we come together and say, well, we're going to have to open a new ASD program to meet the needs of the students. So we, again, develop IEPs based on student need. Now, the other reality to that is that depending on the timing of when that happens and when that service is supposed to start, there might be, especially if we're talking about a program classroom and the overage factor, if I've got to post a position, hire somebody, so it may not happen like that, but if I don't have it documented in the IEP as the need, then I don't have the data. Remember earlier I talked about database decisions, that I don't have the data to take to our cabinet team to say, we need to open this new program and here is the data why. So it's really important that we document in IEPs the service that is needed no matter what our staffing levels are, because that is the data that will allow us to be able to add staff. So within Oakland County, again, there are programs at the local level, and in Rochester, we have resource program support. We have programs for students with emotional impairments. We have ASD program, categorical program classrooms. We have cognitively impaired program classrooms. We have severely multiply impaired program classrooms. So we have lots of programs and supports within the district. However, there are times when we've exhausted all of the programming and resources that we have within the district, and we have to work with Oakland schools to say, we have the situation, they call it a district service request, a DSR. We submit that paperwork to them and say, we're thinking the student might potentially need a more restrictive placement than what we have here in the district, where his needs might be better met. And so we go through that process, and it's not just the school district saying, we want to put him over there. It really is a conversation between the program that we are looking at and the current team to see, what are we doing? Do we need to make any adjustments to what we're doing? And that is even the same process within district. So if I have a student that is a resource student, and maybe right now he's receiving 1 hour of resource a week, and the team comes and says, we'd like to consider moving this student into an ASD program, what we're first going to do is say, have we looked at increasing the student's resource time? Have we looked at what other changes or supports that we could potentially provide for the student in the current setting? So the goal is always, what can we do? Have we done everything that we can do in this setting to meet that student's need before we move to the next setting? And if we haven't, then we may come back, try some new things, look at the data. And then if the data is telling us this is not working, then we may have to move to that next consideration. But again, it really is a process, and it's not just, I want to go over there, or, the teacher saying, no, they have to go. It really is a collaborative process to work through that. Because sometimes it might be environmental, and sometimes it might be that the student really does need that other placement. And so working through that process is important. And these are just the guiding principles that Oakland Schools shares with our team members around providing programs and services for students with IEPs. Again, the goal is always about having students as much as possible be with their same age peers. So, just again, I'm going to sidetrack for a moment. One of the things that we talked about as we think about where are our programs? Should we look at, in places where we have multiple classrooms in one building? Should we look at, maybe spreading that out to have students have more opportunities to be with their classroom, their neighborhood peers? So we're always looking and thinking about what's the best way to serve and support the students in Rochester. And again, the IEP, I just want to remind you, it is a continuous circle. It's a cycle, right? So we're always collecting data, using that data to decide, this is our GPS, which way do we want to go? And then once we've had that conversation, then we're documenting it in the IEP. And again, sometimes we get real rigid in those IEP meetings. Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, and it really is about, let's have a conversation. And the IEP is really about documenting the conversation that we've had, and then implementing that IEP as we've written it, and looking at it, right? And then collecting data. Is this working? We've started this. Do we need to make any adjustments? And then reviewing and updating the IEP. And again, once we've reviewed and updated, we start again with gathering, collecting data and gathering information. And again, this just sums up, eligibility opens that door, and then data is what we use, and there is formal and informal data that we use in developing the IEP. For determining eligibility, that is more formalized data, but when we talk about documenting within the IEP what students' needs are, those are both formal and informal assessments. And again, once we have that, we should always be looking at both strengths and concerns for the student as they relate to their school-based needs. And that's in the present level. That's our baseline. Then we're making goals, developing services, placing the student, but then it always comes back, right? There's that circle. This is a back and forth between placement, present level goals. It's all about what data do we have and what is that data telling us at this time. This one, I know sometimes, like I said, it can be difficult. But one of the things that I wanted to say was I think it's important. And I had a parent email me, I think it was this week, about just she has been having some good conversations with her school-based team. It didn't always start out that smooth because sometimes as special education professionals, we are special, right? So we always, we take what we do to heart, right? So when a parent comes and they are unhappy, that makes us nervous because we're like, well, what do you mean? What, like we take it really personal. And it's, instead of sometimes taking that step back to say, the parent is not attacking me. They're just really looking to see how can we best serve the needs of the student. And so sometimes as parents, we have to give a little space for grace to help building teams work through some processes, but really begin to develop that trust. And let's say if you are working with your service provider and you're having a difficult time, then I might connect in with the building principal and say, hey, here's the scenario. Here's what happened. Can you help me to work through it? And typically we can work through it. If you've talked to the building principal and you still feel like I'm not getting the support that I need, then come on over to the supervisors and myself, and we are here to support you and help really make this collaboration come together. And there are 4 stages of what they call team development. I don't remember them all, but I do know that there are 4 of them. But I do know that there's like the norming, the storming, right? And so sometimes we have to go through those phases as a team before we can really get to the other side where there's that trust and that shared vision. But I think if we continue to even remind teams that what we're all really focused on is what's best for the student, and letting them know that we're not against you. We're here together, and it's about how can we make this work. Now, as parents, you do have, if you've come and you've tried to work with Natasha and Janae and Tiffany, and they couldn't help you, and then you came to me and I couldn't help you, and then you went to Bob and Debbie and they couldn't help you, and you say, I'm filing a state complaint. You always have that right as a parent. We could even work through a facilitated mediation or facilitated IEP process, which I would recommend if you've gone through all those channels and you still can't get the help you need, versus simply filing the complaint, because just typically the state complaint process pulls the team away from truly focusing on the team. But there are times where parents have filed those complaint processes, and maybe there are things as a district that we need to adjust, that we need to have some corrective action on. So the other thing that I've told teams is don't get upset. If a parent files a complaint, it's okay. That's part of the special ed process. What that will do is have us look at data in a different way and then determine what adjustments we need to make as a district. So we recognize that is always there, but know that we are definitely doing our best to work with you and to really collaborate for the benefit of our students. Oh, I've talked about that. And again, these are options that you have as a parent if you are having some difficulties. And that is it. Questions?
All right. Well, I'll kick it off unless you want to take any from the chat. We did get some in advance. I know you covered a lot of this, but I'll read them off anyway, and you can always say that, reference that you covered it. But one parent asked, how can they ask for an evaluation and what subject area is covered? Excuse me, I want to say this right. How often can a parent ask for an evaluation? So I assume what they're asking is that they've asked before and want a different opinion.
So once a student is eligible, there's no timeline on how often the student can be reevaluated. So they can request that reevaluation at any point. However, what will happen is, because of the fidelity of assessment instruments, there might be assessment instruments that cannot be used in the evaluation process because they were used very recently, and so then we can't use them from a fidelity standpoint to complete an evaluation if they've used that instrument usually it's within the last 12 months.
And what about, because this is going to bring us into the next question. What if your child was outright denied and you want to be reevaluated? This person is saying they're moving from another state where their daughter was denied an IEP and or 504, and now is being homeschooled. How would we go about getting an IEP and or 504 when we move to Michigan, as she is thinking of transitioning back to public school? So I think, and that ties into what the first person was asking about, how often you can request an evaluation.
So if they are, there's a few pieces to it. So I'll start with, let's say you are currently living in Michigan and homeschooling your student. You can reach out to the district and request, if you've registered as a homeschool with the state, and request that the district complete a special ed evaluation for your student. But again, you would need to be registered with the state as a homeschool to be able to access that. Once, let's say we went through that process and it was determined that the student was eligible, then we could talk about how services and supports might be provided, and it would likely be similar to what we do with students who are in non-public schools, where they have access to ancillary services and consultation support from teachers. The evaluation piece, just in general, if you move from out of state into Michigan, students will have to, whether they had eligibility or not, would need to. So if they were eligible in Florida and they come in from out of state, we are required to reevaluate that student as an initial IEP. If they say they were in Florida in March and they just moved here in April and they want to request an IEP, it's just a matter of providing a written request to a building administrator, and then we will move forward with processing that.
Okay. And we have a question in the chat. Does the reevaluation that is done from outside of school also consider during the review of IEP? And actually, we had another question that was similar. Does my private diagnosis have to be considered? So I think those kind of go together.
Because those are things that are done outside of school, if you share that with the team, then that is data that should be documented and considered as part of the either eligibility or IEP development process.
Okay. I love how this person phrased their question. They just wrote recovery services. So.
Listen, I'm trying to.
We all want to know.
So we are working on those. Just give us about another week or so, but we are getting there. But I will say this, and which is what I've been saying. I've had a couple parents reach out to me. Go ahead and make your summer camp plans. And if there's some kind of conflict, then we'll work on some other way to provide some recovery support. So I don't want students to miss out on some of those great summer opportunities for some extra reading support that we can figure out later, right? So the summer, I think some of those opportunities are great, and they're only offered in the summer, and we can be a little flexible with the recovery component if we need to.
Would you mind explaining them for anyone who's not familiar with recovery services?
Oh, sure. Well, let's see. I'm going to give them my nice politically correct version. So recovery services are essentially recommended by the Michigan Department of Education for students who have an IEP. It's suggested that IEP teams look at how the students were impacted as a result of the pandemic in relation to how their gen ed peers were impacted during the pandemic. And if there was some significant impact to them as a student with an IEP, because we know that really every child was affected by the pandemic. But if there was some significant impact for a student, then MDE is recommending that districts provide recovery services to students. But there's no hard and fast around what those services have to look like. So, and that's why I said we have some flexibility, and those summer opportunities, especially since students didn't get to have some of those opportunities last summer. I think it's important for them to have them this summer, and we can, give that extra support for those goals and objectives in a different way later.
If you haven't been in touch with your teacher or haven't heard anything about it, you should just reach out to whoever handles your IEP.
Yes, if you have questions about it, I would say connect with your child's special ed team to see what the determination was for that.
This person had a specific question, so he or she said that, just to let her know or him know if they should go somewhere else. But the question is, are there any general education teachers or para educators in the RCS district with expertise in language-based disabilities? And where can they direct that question?
What do they mean by language-based disabilities?
That was the question. If the person wants to speak up, they can. I don't know if they're here.
What I will say, I'll say this. I do know that, and by language, I don't know if they mean like language acquisition versus foreign language. So that's where I'm wondering, but I'm going to go with language acquisition. So we do have teachers that have been trained in programs that are explicit reading instruction programs, such as Orton Gillingham, other language-based programs. And then we are, Oakland Schools is offering some training this summer, but then we're looking to also offer that training to a broader group of, my goal would be special ed resource teachers, program teachers, some speech therapists as well, because my past experience has shown that when we built the whole team, and even some gen ed teachers as well, I would offer it to be able to support some of our students with IEPs, maybe with a specific learning disability in some of those reading and language areas. When we have the whole team of professionals working together around building that support for the student, the results and the outcomes are fantastic. So we'll get there.
What happens if an IEP goal is not met?
We look at why it wasn't met. Sometimes was it an appropriate goal? Were there some factors that contributed to the student not being able to access support? So looking at why, and then, again, realigning that goal to better meet with whatever the student's needs are. Or again, if there were some issues maybe with attendance and the student wasn't in attendance, is there a way that we can work with the family to help to ensure that the student is able to access the service and support?
I've got kids in the background here. I hope I'm not.
I know, I love it. I heard them. It's great.
Okay. So I keep muting and unmuting. We had a question in the chat and then another one similar submitted beforehand, that if they want to make modifications in between IEP meetings, which we kind of touched on, but.
Yeah, if you want to make adjustments to IEPs in between meetings, reach out to your team and say, I'd like to have a meeting, and then let them know why and what your concerns are, so that when they come together, they kind of know, what the focus of that meeting is, what type of information they should have prepared to be able to discuss at that time. So that's that's what should really happen.
And you don't necessarily have to have a full team meeting. Someone asked me this question recently, a parent actually, do we need to have a full team meeting every time? And I don't believe that to be the case. You can talk to whoever handles your IEP.
Right. You don't have to. If you're making changes, even from an amendment standpoint, that would require all team members coming together to agree on that amendment. But if you just want to talk about some components of the IEP, get some updates on how things are going, review some data, that does not need to be the whole team. Or as a parent, you can always excuse certain required IEP team members if you just want to have a very narrow conversation as well.
Great. And from the chat, concerning assessment and evaluation, what kind of comprehensive assessments are available at RCS? Our Kaufman test / Woodcock-Johnson. I'm not familiar with these.
Yeah, so I
Possible
know that
options.
we offer the Woodcock Johnson. I am not sure if we have the Kaufman, but if that is, I see Natasha shaking her head. Yes, that means she's. So yeah, I was gonna say, and if that is one that you wanted, and we didn't, then we could work through that.
What are the criteria for, I think we kind of covered this, but what are the criteria for applying, receiving summer support and recovery programs?
So each IEP team had a checklist that they reviewed for students to look at certain data components to see how students performed. So I would say check in with your team about that particular checklist, and then that can let you know what data they looked at to, think about if this student was one that would be recommended for recovery services.
Great, Brian. And if anybody wants to speak up, turn your camera on, feel free, but otherwise I'll keep reading the pre-submitted questions. This one is, I find that some years I do not know what the goals will be ahead of time on an IEP. I don't have access to it ahead of time. What is a reasonable amount of time to ask for to look over an IEP before the meeting? It's a great question.
Well, but here's the thing though, right? So I know now I'm talking both sides because technically we're not supposed to write the IEP in full before the meeting. So what you might get before the meeting is the demographics and the PLAF, which is just basically data. And then the other decisions are made at the IEP meeting based on the information that's in the PLAF, which is likely why there aren't goals provided ahead of time. There might be, but again, that really is more of a fluid piece. So I would say at least having that PLAF data and demographic information prior to the meeting are the things I think you should count on having ahead of time. Other pieces, not so much. Maybe some supplementary aids and services if it's a student who has been receiving services for a bit, and there are some things that the team kind of recognizes or understands. But yeah, I would say it's mainly demographics and the PLAF.
I've been able to get the draft beforehand. You're saying that they should not be doing that, or do not have to?
I'm saying that we're not supposed to. You got to read between the lines, Melissa. We're not supposed to have the whole IEP written before the meeting.
But the draft is okay. If it says draft on it, like I like to read it a few days in advance. I know. I think that's what the person was asking.
Yeah, you're supposed to get a draft. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Typically.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a time frame on it, or did I miss that? I'm sorry if I missed it.
There's no, and a draft isn't a legal requirement, so there's no timeline on it. Teams typically, I think, try to get them to parents 2 to 3 days ahead of time. But sometimes in the world of COVID, no, it does. I'm sure it's just they're like, we made it.
This is from the chat. Do we have any consideration for behavioral therapists or teachers who could assist the students with autism specifically at RCS, considering to hire someone who are behavioral? I think they're talking about ABA.
So we have been talking about how we can provide some additional support for our students with autism. I know it's my understanding that at one point there was maybe a contracted ABA therapist outside, or BCBA from outside of the district. We've talked about, what I think, and I think the team would agree, kind of what works best is having someone who is dedicated to Rochester. And so we're looking at, what that, what's the best we can do with that. Should that be a BCBA? Should that be social workers with special expertise? Should that be, another ASDTC? What should that be to really provide that support?
Okay. How to go about having a parent teacher communication written into the IEP, whether it be weekly, monthly, etc.
Well, the IEP is about documenting what the student needs. And so we might not put into the IEP that there will be a communication between parents. I think that is about that slide that I put up about really finding that way to work together with the team to communicate, and just thinking about the time perspective. What if, sometimes it's hard to balance out, right? Because depending on the size of the caseload, what is something, how can I communicate information? If I'm communicating weekly or daily, communicating that to parents, or are there only certain things that we need to communicate about more regularly? Like, I think talking that through with them, and even helping, again, the IEP team understand what data you're looking for, how you intend to use that data, can help them understand how to share information with you.
Okay. How should outside private therapy or medical information be shared with the team, and where should it be added within the IEP?
Usually, if there's some medical information that would be included in the PLAF, there's a section for that. Um, how it's provided, I think that's up to the parent how you provide it. Sometimes they might have a written a written report from the professional. Sometimes they've asked, can the person come to the meeting and share the information? So I think there are multiple ways to be able to have that. It might be having a release of information and giving a member of the IEP team permission to consult with that individual before the IEP meeting. So I think it can happen in a number of ways.
What should parents do if they don't feel the slotted time, which they've indicated is an hour, is enough time for that meeting?
So if listen, this happens all the time. That maybe if an hour isn't enough, then you can say we can start in on today. We have an hour, and then we'll pick up on another day. So there've been IEPs sometimes that have had to have 2 or 3 sessions to finish those IEPs, um, and that's okay as a parent to say, uh, let's take our time and go through this. If we need to schedule a part 2, that's okay.
Um,
I'll say this, even if we don't want our IEPs to be overdue, but I also want parents to be comfortable with our process. And if you know that, then maybe let the team know ahead of time that I anticipate that I'm gonna need a little extra time, so that they can factor that into the planning, so that if at all possible we don't get into that overdue and get dinged by the state.
best practices for having discussions with individual team members before the IEP meeting.
It honestly depends on the team member. And so I would say, if you are a little concerned about having a conversation, maybe connect with the building principal, or Natasha or Tiffany, and say, I want to have this conversation with the team. Can you help guide me through that? So it does depend on the team.
If I can tack on to that, just kind of on the fly here, what's the escalation process? So then you're talking to your teacher, you're not getting through to them. Where do you go?
Building principal. I will go to your building administrator. Um, if you feel like you've hit a brick road with the building administrator, then I would go to the level supervisor, either Natasha or Tiffany. If you feel like, which they're wonderful, like, if Trust me. I think, and I think you'd be good right there. But if for some reason you felt that it didn't happen there, then that's where you would come to me. And then if you've come to me and you're like, that Concetta, she just would not let me have what I wanted, then you can go to Bob or Debbie. I would say start with Debbie, but hopefully I'm thinking we can work through it. We've had some tough ones this year and we have gotten through them. So I'm confident in the team.
I noticed you skipped Janae. If you have a program kid, would you still then go to your age-based, or would you go to Janae?
Still go to age-based.
Okay.
Yeah, we start there. And then if we need some more expertise, then we pull Janae in if we have to.
Okay. All right.
She's like, yeah, they're pulling me in. Did you see her face? I saw it. I saw it.
I think we kind of answered this, but maybe you could, if parents don't agree to the IEP as it's written, who should they reach out to and when?
I would say it's that same process. So if they disagree with it, start with the provider. If it can't be worked out from there, building principal. If after you've gone through like all the levels, Debbie and Bob, then that's where you could go through a due process with the state of Michigan. So I don't like those though, but if
Yes. Okay, and then we had a question of why are move up conversations lumped in with the IEP?
Well, the move up conversation is about what the student needs as they transition to the next level. And if the student has an IEP, that's a critical component of data around what those student needs are. And so I think that's why we have those conversations at IEP meetings.
Concetta, can I add something real quick too on that move up conversation piece? Right. So the conversations beforehand are super important with the team, but we part of the IEP process is not to predetermine prior to coming to that table, because like we were saying, it's an IEP team decision at that IEP meeting to have those conversations about what those programs and services are as part of that IEP process. So that's why a lot of the conversations do take place at the IEP meeting, because that's where that programs and services are determined, not before an IEP meeting takes place.
Okay, and we had a comment in the chat. One more step you can go to before going to state complaint is Oakland mediation. The mediation process still allows the parents and the school control over outcome.
Yes, and I will say that is one of the I'll say the bad experiences that I had with the state complaint process. I thought about telling them about it, but I just decided not to. But they pretty much, which I don't even know how they could bring themselves to do it, they told us what to put in an IEP. Now, that goes against everything that I just sat here and said today. And it wasn't even what the parent wanted, but as a result of the parent filing the state complaint, MDE decided what we were going to put into the IEP. And so that is one thing that, and again, it wasn't at all what the parent wanted. So that's one of the things that I do caution against when we begin to move through that, is that we do lose the true ability to really collaborate and come together to try to solve the problem.
Yeah. Oh, if anyone has more questions, they can put it in. But if you don't mind, I'm going to share my recent IEP experience, because it was actually a really good one. And, we got moved this year in the middle of the year, and it was just, unfortunate. It was pandemic. It wasn't anybody's fault. But we got moved. Well, we didn't get moved. I should rephrase that. It was suggested that we move for a better opportunity. And I cried for like 12 hours, but because we've had such great experiences up until now. So I just didn't think anybody would be able to top, what we've had in the past. But we really had a good experience with our IEP. We have a new teacher who came with 20 years experience. It was a very, very well written IEP. First of all, like I could read it. I mean, it's not my first rodeo, but I could read it and understand it. She did give it to me 2 days in advance because I asked her to. The draft, not the so. But the other thing that was really good was all of our ancillary staff. I don't know if I throw that word around. I'm not sure if it's the right word, but the speech person, the social worker, the OT, which we just added, all reached out to me beforehand. In addition to the teacher, we actually ended up having a Zoom call about a week in advance. Everybody to get the input and say, this is what I'm going to put. What do you think? How do you feel? And it was all collaborated. And then I got the draft 2 days before, and I sat down with the draft. I read it over. And then I went back to the teacher and I said, this question, blah, blah, blah. We went back and forth. Changes were made. By the time we sat down to actually have that IEP meeting, it was literally just a formality. It was like, okay, we were done in like 40 minutes. And I felt like I had to apologize because I'm like, okay, I don't want anyone here to think we don't care about our son. It's just, we already did all this. Like, we're good. It's all good. Like, we're happy with what's in the document because we already did the work. And I always say, it's kind of like, if you have an employee evaluation, they say if your boss has done their job, by the time you sit down for your evaluation, there are no surprises. And that is the IEP kind of translates a little bit to that. If your teacher has been properly communicating with you, if your principal and all of your staff, all your ancillary staff have been communicating with you throughout the year, by the time you sit down for that IEP, it should be like, this is a formality. You should be able to like drink a cup of coffee and just, whatever. And that's exactly what happened. And this is reminding me, I've been meaning to send a note to the principal because I'm sure you can use something positive, but it really, I've been meaning to, but yeah, it really was a positive experience. And so I just wanted to share that as an example of, how I believe an IEP should go.
No, that's great. I love hearing that.
Yeah. Well, I'm out of questions. I don't know if you have other things that you wanted to say.
No, I was going to say, Tiffany was going to try to come, but her mom was having a procedure today, so she didn't. That is why she's not here. I told her I forbid her from entering this meeting tonight.
Thank you. Yeah, she did reach out to Anna as well and pass it along to me. Yeah, I mean, if anybody ever needs anything from the PAC, if you don't know who we are, we're the Parent Advisory Committee. We have reps in almost every school. We need some reps for next year too. We just try to work collaboratively and be your supporters of the school district as well as supporters of the parents.
No, this was good.
Yeah. That's all I have. Lots of thank yous coming in the chat if you.
So, yeah. Any parting thoughts, Natasha or Janae? Okay. Nope. All right.
Go and enjoy the last bit of sunshine and warm weather we have left for tonight. Yeah. Get some fresh air and a nice cup of coffee and enjoy your evening.
Coffee, right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. Good night.